Hi, and welcome to an unfortunately brief, but hopefully informational look at one of the coolest decades ever, the 1920s in the Soviet Union and Stalin's rise. First, we can take a look at the historical context. There were about four major events or issues that were going on in at the end of the Civil War and in the time just after it that we want to look at. First of all, the Kronstadt Uprising. If you remember, Kronstadt is a naval base outside Petrograd. It was historically very far left. It was one of the staunch supporters of the Bolsheviks earlier in the Revolution and in the Civil War. But now, in March 1921, the sailors and the workers there rebelled, in bloody fashion against the Bolsheviks. They were fed up with war communism, and they were fed up with the feeling that their political voices were being squelched by the Bolshevik crackdown on opposition. And this was a huge shock to the Bolsheviks, and Lenin especially, and in some ways kind of pushed Lenin towards realizing that something would need to change. At the same time, Lenin, crushed this rebellion, pretty much without mercy. He had good old General Tukhachevsky, you may remember from the Russo-Polish War, take the Red Army and just send wave after wave of soldiers across the ice to the naval base. This was March, so it's still kind of icy. Just with commissars with machine guns lined up behind them to make sure nobody turned around. And within a few hours, there were over 10,000 bodies just lying on the ice. It was a really horrible, bloody mess. But in the end, the uprising was put down. The next big thing is the new economic policy. And that was Lenin's response to Kronstadt and to the damage that he recognized from war communism, that war communism had done during the Civil War. So this was, if war communism was a step towards harsh socialism, harsh, stringent government control of the economy, NEP, the new economic policy, was a step away. It was a step back towards small-scale capitalism. And small scale because it was really only allowing the small scale peasants, small scale traders to ply their trade, sell their goods. Anything that had to do with industry, say, like the larger factories, anything that had to do with transportation, with munitions, obviously, with heavy machinery, still stayed in the hands of the state. But the NEP was actually really quite successful in getting the economy going again. It was actually a lot more successful than anybody had thought it would be. The next thing is a major kind of clamp down on discussion within the party. You may remember democratic centralism, Lenin's the aspect of Leninism, that there could be debate on issues, but then once the issue was decided by the leader or the leadership, then that was that. The ban on factions in 1921 made this a very much enforced policy in communist Russia at that time, which meant there were not only could kind of dissent and disagreement take any kind of organized form within the party. It also meant that there could be no non-Bolshevik parties in, say, the Soviets or in political life. And finally, you had the decline of Lenin. He was an intensely hard worker, a very driven person, and he had a series of strokes starting in 1922 that continued and that weakened him, and that forced him to take a step back from the day-to-day working of the party. And at the same time, the being able to step back did allow Lenin, who I think he realized he didn't have too much time left, and the time away from day-to-day running of the party allowed him to focus in on some broader issues, like what would happen once he was gone. And perhaps the chief thing that he worried about were the personalities of other top Bolsheviks, other top communists. And during this time period, he especially began to worry about Stalin. He thought Stalin was crude, Stalin was paranoid, was bloodthirsty, was was very uncompromising and undemocratic, which, kind of ironic coming from the guy who just banned factions within the Communist Party. Well, Lenin was definitely correct. Part of this grew from a time when Stalin was trying to get Lenin on the phone, and he got Lenin's wife, and Lenin's wife would not put Stalin through to Lenin, and so Stalin just tore into her, and really horrible, crude language. And Lenin took this very personally. He also, in this testament, he outlined all the major strengths and weaknesses of the other leaders. Of course, the joke is, well, kind of a joke, that this was suppressed after Lenin died, so nobody, the public, never got to see this. If this had been released, Stalin would have basically been destroyed and would have been removed from his leadership posts. But in the end, it did not happen. So, Lenin dies. When he died, there was an inner circle of about 5 top communists, starting with Trotsky, whom we already know, brilliant, arrogant theorist. He's got a very strong base of support in the far left of the party, and in the Red Army. So a very formidable opponent to anyone else. He didn't suffer fools kindly, and he was probably not the dictator that some people kind of imagined him to be at the time. He was actually, in a lot of ways, very interested in coalition building. Second, you had Zinoviev, who is, he's probably my least favorite of all these guys. He was cowardly. He was always running away, trying to sneak away from any kind of danger as a revolutionary before the revolution, and as a top figure during the Civil War. He was very vain. He gave speeches, but he wasn't really a good theorist. Not a very impressive guy, as we'll find out when all of these guys are executed or assassinated one after the other. His true colors continued to come out during that time period. And he was the Leningrad party boss, so he had a very strong base in the city that was, unfortunately for him, and to some extent, it was no longer the most important city in the Soviet Union. That would be Moscow, once the capital moves to Moscow. And the Moscow party boss was a guy named Kamenev. Kamenev and Zinoviev you're going to see together a lot. They are usually working together in one way or the other. Kamenev was kind of the grandpa of the party. He was very a smart intellectual person, but also a little bit head in the clouds. He wasn't really a born leader. He was more of a thinker, and that will show in the way that he's outmaneuvered later on by Stalin. Fourth, you had Bukharin, who's the most popular top man of the party. Lenin loved him. He thought he was the best theoretician in the party. He thought he was what he called the golden boy, meaning the most popular. He had a very interesting life as well. He was very artistic and had a broad range of interests, and he definitely liked to enjoy the finer things in life. Finally, Stalin. We're going to get a little more into Stalin's background, since he's going to loom largest over this entire unit. He was born 1878 in Georgia, so not ethnically Russian. He always spoke Russian with a very strong accent, and he was born to a very violent alcoholic family. His father beat his mom beat him, everyone beat everyone. and he was born poor. He had a lot of things. Freud would look at this page and think that the entire history of the Soviet Union was basically here because all of Stalin's peculiarities or issues or tendencies could be traced back to his to his upbringing. But he also Stalin was very physically, I guess, shy about or physically embarrassed by his smallpox scarring. He always had pictures of him doctored later on in his life. He had one arm that was not very useful and shorter than the other, and he also did a good deal to try to hide this from people. And it's been theorized, at least, that these kind of physical things kind of gave him a will to dominate others, that he was always having something to prove. In his teens, he was studying to be an Orthodox priest, but he was kicked out of seminary. There are multiple stories about why this happened. He later said that it was because he was advocating Marxism. His mom chose to believe it was because of his bad health. It's also been said that it was for violence or just because he couldn't pay the fees. So one of the mysteries of his past. But in any case, this whether he found Bolshevism before or after, he very much threw himself into Bolshevism with kind of the energy of a religious convert about this time period. He was in a lot of ways the kind of street fighter for the Bolsheviks in Georgia and the Caucasus. He robbed banks, kidnapped people, assassinated the occasional industrialist, and fairly successfully, although he was arrested many times and sent to Siberia, which has led to a rumor, a persistent rumor about him that he actually was secretly working for the Okhrana, for the Tsar's secret police during this time period, and that's why he never received an incredibly harsh sentence. That's why he was always able to kind of escape, in quotation marks, and get back to Petersburg or to the Caucasus. And that's also a legend about him it's unclear whether that's true or not. He definitely had some of his kind of opponents in the underground killed, but whether he turned them into the police is unclear. He was still kind of a minor figure in the party during the revolution, and it was really during the Civil War that he came more to the attention of Lenin, and he was put in charge of he was Minister for Nationalities, or the Bolshevik position for that, in the government after the revolution, and from there he kind of worked his way into the thick of things by taking the job that nobody else really wanted. It seemed very boring and not flashy, not for someone of the great intellect of Bukharin or Trotsky. Just the guy who decides what the agenda is going to be at meetings, and who fills posts in the party or in government. But as it turns out, these kind of boring organizational details are exactly the things that are going to make Stalin, in the end, the most formidable of all of these contenders. So we're back to 1924. Lenin has died. Stalin gets off to his maneuvering very early, very quickly. When Lenin dies, Trotsky's in the south. Trotsky's kind of sick. He's recuperating in the south, and Trotsky sends Stalin a message asking when the funeral's going to be, and Stalin tells him that it's actually already taken place, even though that's not true, and Trotsky could have gotten back in time. thus basically making Trotsky look like a monumental jerk. And and Stalin went on to position himself as Lenin's heir apparent, as his most trusted second-hand man or right-hand man, which was not the case. He was Stalin and Lenin were very much on the outs by Lenin's death. So Stalin gets off to a very quick start, and over the course of the next 5 years or so, there are going to be three main issues that Stalin rides to supremacy. By 1929 or so, Stalin is, he's not unassailable. He's not a totalitarian leader by 1929, but he is clearly first among other leaders of the Communist Party. But how he gets there is complicated. He gets there, like I said, kind of riding on the back of three important issues. The first one was whether the communists would be ruled by one person, by one dictator, or whether there would be more of a collaborative group leadership. Most of the top communists thought Trotsky wanted a dictatorship, and that Trotsky wanted to be that dictator. They looked back, they were very historically informed, they looked at the French Revolution very much, and they feared a Napoleon, and Trotsky, as like Napoleon, the brilliant person coming from the army with potentially the army's support, seemed the most reasonable candidate, and so they turned against him almost as a group. The other top communists, Kamenev and Zinoviev, formed a triumvirate, a group of three with Stalin. Stalin as the third wheel of the bicycle, according to Zinoviev and Kamenev, because they underestimated him. And Zinoviev and Kamenev went after Trotsky. They attacked him in the newspapers. They had their supporters undercut Trotsky's ideas, accuse him of non-Marxist thought. All of these kind of political attacks. These are not physical attacks. The top communists during this time period, they're piling up millions of bodies, from the Civil War, but they're not spilling blood kind of amongst each other. Something to keep in mind, because this is going to change very drastically, and it takes people a little while to realize that this is changing once Stalin finally does start executing the other leaders. Stalin, during this time period, he's content to kind of stay in the background and just keep filling different roles with his supporters, with people who owe him things, with less educated workers from peasant backgrounds who don't really care about, say, what Trotsky or Kamenev have to say in terms of the theoretical issues, but they know that Stalin got him the job, which will make them loyal to Stalin. So that was those attacks by Zinoviev and Kamenev were fairly successful in getting Trotsky out of his important party position. The next major issue was, it's kind of tricky. This one is known as permanent revolution or socialism in one country. And permanent revolution refers to the Leninist idea that once the revolution occurs in the weakest link of the capitalist chain, that it will spread to all the other countries of the world. And this carries with it the idea that Russia, that the USSR, now needs to be doing its best to actually export the revolution to the other countries, especially Germany, England, France, to some extent the US or Italy. Now Trotsky and the leftist part of the communists, and all the Communist Party is, the entire Communist Party is on the left, but within the communists they talk about the left and the right. And so the left of the Communist Party wanted this permanent revolution, the left like, say, Trotsky, whereas the right, which is more Bukharin, wanted socialism in one country, wanted to focus on developing the Soviet Union's economic capabilities without necessarily getting entangled with in conflict with other countries. And this went hand in hand with NEP, with the new economic policy. So Stalin was able to ally with Bukharin on the right, and together they attacked Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Trotsky, who now found themselves in an alliance against Stalin and Bukharin. And Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Trotsky were called the United Opposition. But united though they may have been, Stalin had done his job and had built up enough organizational support that he could expel all these three from the party. They no longer had their positions. They were, they were basically, to some extent, finished politically. And finally, the third thing was, the third major issue was whether to keep the new economic policy or to get rid of it in favor of rapid forced industrialization. And the thing about the new economic policy was that it was kind of hands-off in some ways of the peasantry. But if you remember things from previous Russian history, the way to industrialize rapidly is basically to squeeze as much blood as possible out of the peasantry, or at least enough money as possible out of the peasantry. So rapid industrialization and NEP are in some ways mutually exclusive. Now NEP, which was popular on the right of the party among people like Bukharin, had previously been supported by Stalin, but now Stalin turned on it. He said, nope, that is too capitalist, we need to get back to socialism, and he, using cleverly the more centrist and leftist people who he had just vanquished on the question of permanent revolution or socialism in one country, Stalin used these leftists against Bukharin, and thus did the same thing, attacked Bukharin politically, criticized him in newspapers, accused him of non-Marxist ideas, and so on, and basically had him voted out of all of his party posts, which, Bukharin being gone, that leaves Stalin, by the end of 1928 and the beginning of 1929, it leaves Stalin as the only top communist left. And that is all we're doing for now.